Harlan David Sanders entered the world on September 9, 1890, in a simple four-room house in Henryville, Indiana. His early years were painted with the rustic hues of rural American life: dirt roads, farm work, close-knit family ties. He was the eldest of three children born to Wilbur David and Margaret Ann Sanders. The foundational stability of his world fractured when he was just 5 years old. His father, Wilbur, came home one day feeling unwell and passed away shortly thereafter. Margaret Sanders, now a widow with 3 young children to support, had to find work to keep them afloat. This profound shift in the family dynamic thrust young Harlan into a new, unexpected role. It was in this crucible of necessity that Harlan Sanders discovered his first true calling: cooking. He learned to bake bread, mastering the finicky nature of yeast and flour. He learned to prepare vegetables. He learned to handle what little meat they could afford. The kitchen became his domain, a place where he could provide comfort and sustenance for his family in a world that had suddenly become uncertain and frightening. By the age of 7, he was reportedly a proficient cook, capable of preparing a variety of regional dishes. This experience, forged in the heat of a family tragedy, planted a seed. It was a skill, a passion, and a source of pride that would lie dormant for decades, waiting for the right moment to blossom into something the world would one day savor. The weight of responsibility and the lure of independence pulled Harlan Sanders away from formal education at an early age. After a contentious relationship with his stepfather, he left home and school behind in the 7th grade. At just 13 years old, he began a long and winding journey through the American workforce, a restless search for a place to land. He worked as a farmhand on a nearby farm in Greenwood, Indiana. He moved to New Albany, Indiana, where he found work as a streetcar conductor, navigating the clanging trolleys through the city streets. He then enlisted in the United States Army, serving a brief stint in Cuba before being honorably discharged. Upon his return, the railroad beckoned. He became a railroad fireman for the Southern Railroad, a gritty, soot-covered job that involved shoveling coal into the fiery belly of a steam locomotive. It was here he met his first wife, Josephine King, and started a family, adding the pressures of being a husband and father to his already challenging life. After losing his railroad job, he tried his hand at studying law by correspondence, even practicing for a time in the Justice of the Peace Courts in Little Rock, Arkansas. Yet this too came to an end after a courtroom brawl with his own client. The list of jobs grew longer. He sold insurance, he operated a steamboat ferry, he started a company manufacturing acetylene lamps, he worked as a tire salesman for Michelin. Each venture seemed to promise a fresh start, a new path to stability and success. And each, in its own way, ended in failure or disappointment. Sanders was not lazy. He was a relentless worker. He was hot-tempered, proud, and unwilling to suffer fools gladly. This combustible mix of ambition and impatience meant that no single job could hold him for long. He was a man in constant motion, accumulating a vast library of experiences and setbacks. This period was not a series of failures so much as it was a long, arduous, and unconventional apprenticeship in the hard realities of business and life. What set Harlan Sanders apart was not the sheer number of his failures, but his remarkable inability to be defeated by them. Where another person might have surrendered to despair or settled for a life of quiet mediocrity, Sanders simply picked himself up and looked for the next opportunity. His life was a testament to the power of reinvention. He did not see each closed door as a final judgment on his abilities, but rather as a signal to find a different door to open. This innate resilience was the common thread weaving through his chaotic early career. Something better was just around the corner if he kept moving. This spirit wasn't blind optimism, but gritty, practical determination. He possessed an almost defiant self-belief. After his short-lived legal career imploded, he did not spend years lamenting. He moved his family back to Indiana to live with his mother, then took a job as a laborer for the Pennsylvania Railroad. His acetylene lamp venture failed as electric lighting rose, but he did not give up on business. Instead, he pivoted, applying what he'd learned to the next attempt. He understood that staying stagnant was the only true failure. Consider the breadth of his attempts: manual labor, white-collar sales, public service, private enterprise. Selling insurance taught him the art of the pitch. Operating a ferry taught him logistics and customer service. Trying, failing, trying again. This cycle wasn't instability, but a deliberate experiment. He prototyped his own career, testing different versions of himself. From his teens into his 30s, it was a masterclass in perseverance. He wasn't yet Colonel Sanders, but the raw materials, the grit, the hustle, the unyielding spirit were being fired in the kiln of adversity. In 1930, as Harlan Sanders approached his 40th birthday, his long and winding road finally led him to a dusty crossroads in Corbin, Kentucky. The Great Depression was tightening its grip on the nation, but Sanders saw opportunity where others saw despair. He took over the lease on a Shell gas station situated along U.S. Route 25, a major thoroughfare for travelers heading to Florida and the Carolinas. It was a modest enterprise, just a single gas pump and a small adjacent structure. For a man who had already failed at a dozen other careers, this might have seemed like just another stopgap, another temporary gig, until the next thing came along. However, this time was different. Sanders was no longer just a young man drifting from job to job. He was a seasoned, if not yet successful, entrepreneur with a family to support. He poured his formidable energy into the gas station, determined to make it work. He understood that in a competitive market, service was everything. He offered to check customers' oil and fill their tires with air, small gestures that built a reputation for quality and care. He was a natural promoter, and his little station soon became a reliable stop for weary travelers navigating the winding roads of the Appalachian Mountains. It was his keen observation of these travelers that sparked the next evolution of his business. He noticed that many of them were hungry, with few decent options for a meal in the rural area. The old instincts from his childhood, from those days spent in his mother's kitchen cooking for his siblings, began to stir. He cleared out a small storage room in the back of the station, set up a single dining table with 6 chairs, and began serving the food he knew best: simple, hearty, home-style Southern dishes. He offered pan-fried chicken, country ham, fresh vegetables, and fluffy biscuits. The little dining room, which he named Sanders Court and Cafe, was an immediate success. Word of mouth spread among the truck drivers and families who frequented Route 25. His reputation for good food quickly began to eclipse his reputation for good service at the gas pump. The demand grew so rapidly that the single table was no longer enough. He soon moved his operation across the street to a larger building that could accommodate a proper restaurant and even a small motel. The gas station had been the entry point, but food was the destination. In the heart of Kentucky, at the age of 40, Harlan Sanders had finally found the business that fit him. With his restaurant now thriving, Harlan Sanders became obsessed with a single, all-consuming goal: perfecting his fried chicken. Pan frying was the traditional method, but it was slow and inconsistent. Each order took around 30 minutes to prepare, creating long waits for his hungry customers, limiting his ability to serve the growing crowds. Sanders, ever the innovator, knew there had to be a better way. He needed a method that could deliver the crispy crust and juicy interior, but with the speed and efficiency required for a bustling restaurant. His first breakthrough came with the advent of the commercial pressure cooker in the late 1930s. Sanders saw its potential immediately. He bought one of the first models available and began to experiment. The initial results were, well, disastrous. The early cookers were dangerous and prone to explosions. But Sanders was undeterred. He tinkered and modified, working with the manufacturer to create a safer, more reliable version that could be used for frying. He discovered that by pressure frying the chicken, he could cook it in a fraction of the time, under 10 minutes, while locking in the moisture and flavor in a way that pan frying never could. He had solved the problem of speed. Now he turned his attention to the flavor itself. He wanted a taste that was unique, memorable, distinctly his own. So he began a long and methodical process of experimentation with various herbs and spices, seeking the perfect blend to coat his chicken before it went into the pressure fryer. This was not a random process. It was a meticulous, almost scientific endeavor. He would mix a batch of seasoning, cook a chicken, and taste it. Then he would adjust the ratios, adding a little of this, taking away a little of that, and try again. The kitchen of his Corbin restaurant became his laboratory. After months of relentless testing, he finally landed on the ideal combination. It was a precise and proprietary mixture of 11 different herbs and spices. The exact ingredients became one of the most closely guarded trade secrets in culinary history, famously locked away in a vault. This secret recipe, combined with his innovative pressure frying technique, created a product that was unlike anything else. The chicken was incredibly flavorful with a crispy, seasoned crust that gave way to tender, juicy meat. It was consistent, it was fast, and it was delicious. Harlan Sanders had not just created a good meal, he had invented a culinary icon. The success of Sanders Court and Cafe did not go unnoticed. His reputation for exceptional food and hospitality spread far beyond the confines of Corbin. Travelers actually planned their routes specifically to include a stop at his establishment. His restaurant became a destination in its own right, celebrated for its contribution to the state's cuisine. In 1935, in recognition of his growing fame and his services to the community, Kentucky Governor Ruby Laffoon bestowed upon him an honorary title, Kentucky Colonel. This was a significant honor, the highest title of dignity the Commonwealth could grant, but at the time it was largely ceremonial. Harlan Sanders, however, was a master of marketing long before the term was commonplace. He understood the power of a good story and a strong image. He embraced his new title with gusto. He began referring to himself as Colonel Sanders, and he cultivated a persona to match. He grew his now famous goatee. He started dressing the part of a distinguished Southern gentleman. This was not merely an affectation, it was a deliberate branding strategy. The title of Colonel lent an air of authority, tradition, authenticity to his food. It transformed him from a simple restaurant owner into a character, an embodiment of Southern hospitality. His business continued to flourish throughout the 1940s. He expanded his restaurant and motel, which became a sprawling enterprise that could seat 142 people. He was a local legend, a respected businessman, and a pillar of his community. Duncan Hines, the famous travel guide author, gave Sanders Court and Cafe a glowing recommendation in his Adventures in Good Eating. For a time, it seemed that Harlan Sanders had finally achieved the stable success that had eluded him for so long. He had built a prosperous life for himself in Corbin, centered around his beloved restaurant. But the relentless march of progress, which had once boosted his business, would soon threaten to destroy it. In the 1950s, the federal government began planning the construction of a new interstate highway system. The proposed route for Interstate 75 would bypass the town of Corbin entirely, diverting the steady stream of travelers that was the lifeblood of his restaurant. Sanders saw the writing on the wall. The world was changing again, and the business he had spent over 2 decades building was about to become obsolete. At an age when most men were planning for retirement, Colonel Harlan Sanders was about to face his greatest challenge yet. Forced to sell his beloved Corbin restaurant at a significant loss, Harlan Sanders found himself at the age of 65, essentially back at square one. All he had to his name was his savings, his first Social Security check of $105, and his secret recipe for fried chicken. While many would have accepted defeat and retired, the Colonel's spirit of reinvention kicked in. He saw not an ending, but a daunting beginning. His idea was audacious: travel the country and convince other restaurants to sell his chicken. He made a simple business pitch. Owners would pay a nickel per piece sold. In return, his secret blend of 11 herbs and spices and his pressure frying method. He loaded pressure cookers and seasoning into his Ford, donned a crisp white suit and black string tie, and hit the road. He became a traveling salesman with one product: his chicken. The white suit made him unforgettable. The journey became legend. It was grueling and humiliating. He drove from town to town, walked into restaurants, and asked to speak to the owner. He offered to cook for the owner and staff, confident that the taste alone would sell them. More often than not, he met skepticism, ridicule, and outright rejection. Owners were set in their ways. They said they had their own recipes. They weren't interested. The rejections piled up. He slept in his car to save money, living off the meager meals he cooked for his sales pitches. He heard the word no again and again. According to the legend that he himself helped to cultivate, he was rejected over 1,000 times. The exact number is impossible to verify, but the scale of the failure is not. He faced a wall of indifference, yet for every 100 slammed doors, he remained convinced that the next one might open. His belief in his product was absolute. He knew his chicken was better, and that unwavering conviction fueled his seemingly endless persistence. After months on the road and countless rejections, the Colonel's persistence finally paid off in Salt Lake City, Utah. In 1952, he walked into a restaurant owned by a man named Pete Harmon. Harmon was a progressive and successful restaurateur, and unlike so many others, he was willing to listen. Sanders made his pitch and cooked his chicken. Harmon was immediately impressed, not just by the taste, but by the speed of preparation and the potential for a signature dish. He agreed to the Colonel's terms. This handshake deal with Pete Harmon marked the birth of the very first Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise. The success in Harmon's restaurant was immediate and explosive. Harmon cleverly marketed the new dish as Kentucky Fried Chicken to evoke images of Southern hospitality. He packaged it in the soon-to-be iconic paper bucket for takeout orders. Sales at his restaurant skyrocketed, with the chicken quickly becoming his most popular item. The success of this first franchise served as the crucial proof of concept that Sanders had desperately needed. He now had a powerful story to tell other potential franchisees. He was no longer just selling a recipe, he was selling a proven business model that could dramatically increase a restaurant's profits. With this first success under his belt, the tide began to turn. The process was still slow and arduous, requiring the Colonel to continue his travels. But now he had momentum. He signed up a handful of other franchisees, and as their businesses thrived, the word began to spread throughout the restaurant industry. The rejections became less frequent as his reputation grew. The snowball, pushed for so long up a steep hill, had finally reached the crest and was beginning to roll down the other side, picking up speed and mass with each new franchise he signed. He was no longer just a traveling salesman, he was the head of a rapidly growing network. By the early 1960s, just a few short years after his first deal with Pete Harmon, the growth was becoming exponential. Kentucky Fried Chicken was a phenomenon. The Colonel, in his white suit, had become a nationally recognized figure, his face and story an integral part of the brand's identity. He had successfully franchised his recipe to over 600 restaurants across the United States and Canada. The company had grown too large for one man to manage from the back of his car. The business he had started in his mid-60s, born from the ashes of his failed restaurant, had become a runaway success. In 1964, at the age of 74, Colonel Sanders faced a new kind of problem. His company had become too successful for him to manage. The logistics of supplying seasoning to hundreds of franchisees, maintaining quality control across a continental operation, had become overwhelming. Recognizing his limitations, he made the difficult decision to sell the American operations of Kentucky Fried Chicken to investors led by John Y. Brown Jr., Jack C. Massey, for $2 million. It was a staggering sum for a man who, just a decade earlier, had been living on a meager Social Security check. However, selling the company did not mean retirement for the Colonel. As part of the sale, he retained a lifetime salary and remained the face and goodwill ambassador of the brand. He continued to travel the world, making television appearances, visiting KFC restaurants, his iconic image synonymous with the chicken he had created. He was a stickler for quality, famously criticizing franchisees over gravy, over chicken, when standards slipped. He was more than a mascot, the living embodiment of the brand's commitment to quality, the finger-licking good promise made manifest. Under its new corporate ownership, KFC exploded into a global powerhouse. The franchise model Sanders had pioneered was scaled up with breathtaking speed. Restaurants opened across Europe, Asia, the rest of the world, introducing the Colonel's secret recipe to billions. The simple roadside meal from Corbin, Kentucky, became one of the most recognizable fast food products in history. The Colonel, who had failed at nearly everything for the first 65 years of his life, had created a phenomenon that would outlive him. Harlan Sanders passed away in 1980 at the age of 90, but his story endures as a powerful lesson in perseverance. His life was not a straight line to success, but a chaotic, winding path filled with detours, setbacks, spectacular failures, yet he never allowed his past to define his future. His ultimate triumph is a testament. Never too late to start over, age is no barrier to ambition. Unwavering belief in quality can overcome 1,000 rejections. The Colonel's journey proves the most important ingredient for success is the simple, stubborn refusal to ever give up.